Hey, what's up, everybody? We are back for another Tactica Tuesday. I am Paul Conti, along with my good buddy James Squires, and our illustrious guest for the evening, the godfather of all things Age of Sigmar on the YouTubes, Vince Venturella.
Well, thank you, sir. That name is already taken, but I appreciate the fine compliment. I'll simply, and illustrious is probably also overblown, but I am Vince Venturella. You are right about that. That's the one part of that I will wholeheartedly agree with.
I personally have some reservations about that. I'd like to see a birth certificate and maybe a social security card.
Well, I was found in a basket, floating down a river, just strangely by a pack of old monks. And then I was raised in the Tibetan highlands, taught ancient mystic ways, and then slowly emigrated, took over the identity of a dead man. So I have no proof that that is in fact who I am.
Excellent. That is.
Wait, this isn't live when I'm saying that, right? Oh no, my secret's out.
Sounds like a plot to a good movie, but they'll never make it because you'll have to kill them if they tried.
Exactly, that's right.
Precisely. All right. So, anyway, now that we have our little preamble out of the way, as Vince likes to say before every topic of the week, news. What do we have going on this week and upcoming? I just want to give another plug to the Crossroads GT coming up in September, the 16th through the 18th in Elmira, New York. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. We don't have any new information on it yet as far as like how many points the AOS event is going to be, but stay tuned for that. And the website for that we will link down below afterward as well. And the other bit of news that I have, courtesy of friend of the Warhammer YouTubers in general, Mr. Jeff Egan, who does the PMP reviews with Vince.
Never heard of him.
Never.
I'm just joking.
He so kindly put a lot of effort. He said he put 14 hours into creating a set of cards for Triumphant Treachery for Age of Sigmar. I don't have a link available for that just yet. As soon as I can, I'll get that posted up somewhere for a downloadable file so that you can print off your own cards for a proper AOS game of Triumphant Treachery. I played with it yesterday with, it was a 6-person game, and it was fantastic. It was a lot of fun, even though I was the first person out and had a bunch of really horrible misplays, which we'll talk about later. So, James, news for you, sir.
Well, firstly, clearly you were out of the game first because you're playing free people, and they just can't make the cut, right? But in terms of more,
they come under like 3,000 points, I think. So.
But in terms of news, I kind of mentioned last week that I had a tournament upcoming that I was going to be hosting locally in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and that I would have more information on that. So I'm still working on getting a venue. I'm talking to a couple places where we'd be able to do it for maybe next to nothing. And I got in contact with it's Frontline Gaming, I believe, that makes the fat mats. And I basically told them what I wanted to do. I wanted to run a charity type event. I was inspired by what the War Machine groups do with Food Machine and other type events. There is no real big GT in my local area that I'm aware of, and so I wanted to kind of combine the two and be able to run a semi-annual, maybe every 4 months or so, tournament that would be picking different local charities, and all the proceeds from the tournaments going to that. So in order to do so, obviously the startup cost of running these larger events, getting like the fat mats, getting things like that are expensive, but Frontline Gaming has been more than generous in offering a substantial discount bordering on near cost for them and sending a few additional mats for prize support. I'm currently talking with GW to see if we can get prize support for it, but I'm going to be selling off a couple of my extra 40K armies and Age of Sigmar stuff to try to help get this started. But if you'd like to help, I will be linking the GoFundMe below. which will have more details on it, including details on the charity that we're supporting this time, Center of Hope, which is basically a charity that provides job training and helps people who are going through hard times with food, jobs, education, things like that. It's a really good local charity, so donate to them if you're locally, if you like to, even if you don't feel like taking part in this upcoming tournament. But yeah, that's all I've got right now on that.
So Vince, what do you have going on in your neck of the woods? Do you have any tournaments coming up or anything else you'd like to talk about for event news?
Not really. The next event that I'm going to is probably I'm going to Holy Havoc, right, which is Steve Herner's event. There's several people going from the YouTuber community. I know Hooves and his wife are going to be there. That should be exciting. I know Tyler Emerson's going to be there again. Good guy. So it's all full up. But it is a great event. All the Holy events are really good. I saw Steve talking a lot about the way he likes to run events and stuff like that on Twitter. If you don't follow Steve Herner, I highly recommend it. Not only is the man a hobbying legend, if you've never seen his Skaven army, it is a thing of absolute majesty and beauty. He has a Skaven army called the Rats in Hats, wherein he has green stuffed all of his Skaven to look like sort of jaunty free people fellows, I suppose is what I would say. And they're pretty amazing. So yeah, that's my next one. Tom and I have been talking about our list. We're running Chaos. I'm letting Tom take the lead on this one because Tom is the list guy in our group. He thinks about it a lot. He plans for things a lot. If it was up to me, about a week before the tournament was happening, I'd go, oh crap, we got to turn in a list, don't we? And then that's when that would happen. So it's better that he handles this.
Yeah. So are you planning on coming up for the Crossroads GT? I know that's probably about the same distance for you as it is for me to get to.
Yeah, Crossroads, I thought about it. I had been kind of leaving it in the background until I did see the details because I didn't think they had actually put up all the details yet of when it's or like of exactly how it's going to be run. Am I wrong? Did they post up exactly what's going on with it?
They're definitely going to be using General's Handbook. I think the only thing they really haven't decided yet is what the exact points number is going to be. I've heard that it's going to be somewhere in the range between 2,000 and 2,500, but they haven't nailed down an exact number yet.
Gotcha. Yes, it's still a possibility. I don't know for sure if I'll go yet. It actually isn't that far for me.
Yeah.
It's funny because of the nature of New York, right? Like, it's not... When people say it's in New York, you think, like, oh, you think New York City, but that's not actually correct. It's way, way, way in the western part of New York, or far more western, I should say, than it is eastern, at least.
Yeah, it's probably closer to Ohio than it is to...
New York City. Yeah, you're exactly right, yes. I mean, basically, like, you can, from certain parts of Ohio, you can be in New York, like, pretty fast, because there's just that little, like, bitty piece of Pennsylvania that gets in the way.
Right.
But, yes. So we'll see. I'm still, it's definitely still on the menu. I don't know for sure if I'll be able to go yet or not. It's going to depend a lot on sort of other things going on in that time period.
Understood.
It's such a strange concept to me, being able to drive to another state in less than like 4 hours.
Well, you're the one who decided to live in a mini country instead of a normal state, like all the rest of us. So yeah, you get no sympathy from me.
Right.
In fact, today I drove Massachusetts back to Connecticut, back to Massachusetts again, and then back to Connecticut.
Way too far for me to do that.
Well, you're just the opposite problem. Yeah, you live in like fake states. You live in what most people call cities up there. I mean, come on, it's ridiculous.
Yes.
That's yeah.
This is true. I'm pretty sure Dallas-Fort Worth is bigger than some of those states.
That's absolutely true.
Yep. Yeah. But you know what's interesting? I just from looking stuff up because I'm ridiculous like this. Connecticut has roughly the same population as the entire state of Oklahoma. So, despite our geographic size, we are very densely populated.
Yeah, but Oklahoma, like, it's mostly populated by cows. There's not many people there.
That is true.
But So normally we would have our Q&A in this section, but Paul is just burning up on the inside. He has a bit of a score to settle. If you're not familiar with it, Vince at one time ran a series of YouTube videos called War Games, and they were these little game shows that were putting nerds against each other in real debates about plastic soldiers. I believe that's the way you put it, Vince.
That's exactly right.
And Paul lost on the episode that he was in, to the shame of this show. And so Paul decided he wanted a chance to go at Vince to get his, supposed rematch, right? Because Vince was the judge, so he's taking out on the judge. Now, Paul, being the tricky little guy that he is, didn't want me to tell Vince about this, but I was inspired by Vince and MC1 Gamers covering of Skaven, and I decided to be a good little Skaven and not only tell Vince that this was coming, but flip the script on Paul and not tell him what units we're actually covering in this debate section. But Vince does know.
See, that's true triumph and treachery right there, my friend. You're in the spirit of the thing right there, absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. So for this debate, we have the Pegasus Knight versus the Necropolis Knight. And now I want you both to make your pitch on why each one's better. We do have the points now, so that's a perfectly valid argument. I want it well-rounded, though. I don't want just from you, Paul. Well, they can make 2 attacks, or from Vince, just their snakes. That looks cool. That can be an element of your argument, but I want a well-rounded, well-presented argument. Because I sprung this on Paul, Vince, I'll let you go first.
Sure. So you want me to talk about the snake or the snake surfers first?
Absolutely.
Are we starting with just the positives? I assume, like basically defend what's awesome about our unit, and then later we'll attack the other person's unit. That was the war game strategy. Does that sound a good method to follow?
Sounds good.
All right. So Necropolis Knights, why are they amazing? Okay, sure. Yes, they're the better unit. There's no doubt about it, okay? So Necropolis Knights are 3 for 160 points. All right, let's start there. Perfectly reasonable cost on these guys. What do the base numbers look like? All right, we got a move of 8 inches. They got a base 5 up save, not super great. But they're rocking 5 wounds apiece, okay? Attack profile-wise, you're talking about the guy on top with 2 attacks at 3 up, neg 1, and 1 damage. The captain has an extra attack, so he's kicking out 3. That's fine. So rend on the dudes on top. The Necroserpent itself, the snake, rocking 3 attacks at 4 up, 3 up, neg 1 rend, D3 damage. Okay? And so total, this thing is putting out 5 or 6 attacks, all with rend, part of which being multi-wound. Okay? Now, at the same time, let's talk about what really makes this unit redonkulous. Why is this unit better than any stupid Pegasus Knight? Okay, the answer's simple. When your Pegasus Knights die, they're just dead. And I don't care how good they are. Nothing in AOS is immortal. Things die. And there's no way you're going to tell me they don't. Because you and I have both played enough to know that I don't care how good they are. I don't care if it's Archaon. Things die. Just things leave the table. And when your Bretonnians fly off to join old Lewin up in heaven, woo, up with the elves that were their fake god, okay, that's it. They're gone. Bye-bye. Plant a stone in the ground, because they ain't coming back. But when my knights die, as Game of Thrones has taught us, what is dead can never truly die, because their stupid standard bearer brings back 1 a turn. Just automatic. No spell. No nothing. It just happens that you get this 5-wound wrecking ball back for free. So as long as that standard bearer is alive, the unit's just going to keep regenerating. 5 wounds a turn. Okay? Not to mention the fact that their musician gives them a min 6-inch charge. You ever failed a 3-inch charge in this game? Don't answer yes you have. I know you have. You've rolled snake eyes. I've rolled snake eyes. I played a game on Saturday, and my opponent lost his big bad unit because he failed a 6-inch charge. Like, he didn't get to bring it into my Chaos Warriors. He failed needed a 6, rolled a 4. Sorry about your luck. That meant another unit went in alone, and my Chaos Warriors hacked him to pieces. Okay? and then I was able to pin his other unit in a place where he couldn't retreat to get to me. If he had been Necropolis Knights, he wouldn't fail that, because they always charge a minimum of...
Minimum of... Vince dropped.
Yep. He dropped the mic.
There's more. Okay?
So I just want to point out real quick. I don't know if you got this, Vince, that you like went out for a second.
Oh, sorry.
And then as soon as you came back in, it's like, but wait, there's more.
That's right. They're perfect. But wait, there's more. It was perfectly timed. All right, here you go. Also, their little fangs. If you roll on the snake fangs, if you roll a 6, okay, then it's an additional mortal wound. Not their wound becomes a mortal wound. You do D3 damage plus a mortal wound. Okay. Their save goes up to 4 up in the combat phase if they've got the shields, which of course they're going to, right? And also they grant your wizard the spell Reanimate Necropolis Knights on a 5. That's this many. That's your casting value. 5. It's pretty low. That's an easy number in death. That more or less means automatic casting. What does it do? Pick a unit of Necropolis Knights within 18 inches, add 1 to the unit. That means very easily you can restore 2 of these Wrecking Balls around. 1 automatic, 1 on a cast. There is no way your stupid attack twice, which is what you're going to have to, like, that is going to be your crutch. I already know right now. Like, if that is your crutch that you're going to stand on, and I don't care. That thing's getting kicked right out, because that is not good enough. Go ahead.
All right, Paul. That's a big mountain to overcome.
All right. Well, so let's start in an unlikely place. Yeah, we were talking. Vince was noting that the Necropolis Knights get a minimum charge of 6 inches, right? So what about the Pegasus Knights? They're charging on 4d6, taking the highest 2. So where does that put them? That puts them at about a 4% chance of rolling under 6. So I would take that as pretty much guaranteed making that 6 at least every time. And it pushes their average up tremendously higher. Their median is around a 10. So they are going to be making long bomb charges on top of their far superior movement. Their base movement is double that of the Necropolis Knights. So they're getting in, on average, to something that is 26 inches away from where they started. Whereas the Necropolis Knights, you're looking at 15 inches? That's a pretty big difference in your charge ranges. So the Pegasus Knights, they are a massive threat to the whole board, right? Like, they can just come crashing in on turn 1, go from your deployment zone to your opponent's deployment zone. Nothing else has been moved yet, and they can just knock stuff off the board. But wait, there's more. They're on the charge, which is how you're usually going to be using them. Their save goes to a 3-up, compared to the Necropolis Knights' puny 5-up save. So you're talking about how things die. You know, it's great that these things can regenerate and they can be summoned back onto the table, because guess what? You're going to need that, because these things are going to die over and over and over again. The Pegasus Knights are going to have a lot more staying power on the table. So despite the fact that, yes, once they die, they're gone, they're going to be much less likely to die in the first place. You're not going to need to waste that spell on getting them back onto the board. You're going to be able to use your spells for things like, you know, the Damsel's ability to give them a 5-up ward save to make it even harder for them to be killed, or your Fey Enchantress giving them +1 to hit, bringing them down to a 2 to hit. So all sorts of things going on here that give them some really significant advantages. And now we get into just the raw charge with the double attack. Now, I know. You said it's going to be the great crutch, right? That the Pegasus Knights come in and their big saving grace is that they are going to be able to do that attack twice. But what we need to look at first off is that even when they're not charging, the damage output of the Necropolis Knights is about 8 2/3. The damage output of the Pegasus Knights is about 7. So you're really not getting that much more damage out of the Necropolis Knights when you're, compared to the Pegasus Knights when they're not charging. The Pegasus Knights are on the charge. All of a sudden, they're up to 14 damage versus the roughly 9 damage on average that you're getting out of the Necropolis Knights. So they go from being slightly worse when they're after they grind on the charge to just being completely blown off the table on the charge. And, of course, our head-to-head matchup, these guys getting a charge in on the Necropolis Knights, they're going to blow 2 of them off the board with their puny 5-up save. So I think the inevitable answer is that despite the fact that those Necropolis Knights can come back, despite the fact that the Pegasus Knights are dead once they're dead, and their bonuses really only come on the charge, the massive threat range of the Pegasus Knights, and the fact that they get those charge bonuses basically whenever they want them, and they're rarely going to be getting into combat at any time when they're not. They're rarely going to be receiving a charge because they can sit back with their 16-inch move and not be worried about an opponent coming onto the board near them. So I think overall, on virtually all points, the Pegasus Knights come out ahead.
Wow.
Pretty strong case.
And yes, I did pull up a spreadsheet and math hammer that while Vince was talking.
All right, Vince. Tear him down.
No, that's great. I wondered, Paul, is your argument sponsored by Chef Boyardee? Because that was some weak sauce, homie. Let me explain to you why you just lost your own argument. Like, I appreciate you giving me the math of your own defeat. Thanks. That's super nice of you. Now, let me explain why you just, to our audience who didn't follow your math perhaps, why you just told me I win. Okay? Would you please restate the damage of them on the charge? What was their damage output average?
14.
14. Great. How many wounds does a unit of Necropolis Knights have?
15.
Okay. What's the Necropolis Knights save in combat?
5-up.
No, it's 4-up. I just told you if they have the shields, it's 4-up, which they do. We're in combat. You ain't shooting me. Okay? Like, it's not a costful option. I'm going to say, yes, they have the shields.
Okay.
So your 14 wounds become 7 because you have no rend to speak of on that model, nor can you gain it. So, oops on that. Your 7 wounds don't even kill 2 knights. I auto-regen the 1 knight that you killed on the charge. I'll accept you charge me 100% of the time. You're right. Your mobility is your best argument. You should have leaned on that, buddy. You should have talked about how they might have been good in scenarios or something, but you didn't. And so, in fact, you tried to take it to combat, where I am going to beat you into the dirt. Are you out of your mind? I put out a solid 8. You kill 1 knight a turn on the charge? I'm going to regen that knight for free. I don't even need the spell. And by the way, in match play, where you can only cast 1 of a certain spell a turn, I'm going to have Deathcasters freed up to go ahead and cast that spell, because I bring plenty of Deathcasters around. They're cheap and plentiful. They're pretty good. You may have heard about them in Death Armies. They tend to show up in numbers. So I'm going to easily get back the maybe 1 knight you killed. I'm going to crush your stupid knights, because on the charge turn, you've got a 3-up save, which I turn into a 4-up, the same save as mine. If I put out 8 damage, that's a 4-up for you. How many wounds do Peg Knights have?
4 each.
That's right. And so if I have 8 wounds and you cut my wounds in half, how many Peg Knights are left after that? Oh, quick math, it's 2. I'll let you attack first. Okay? It's still not going to matter because in the grind, you're going to go to 4 up, 5 up. In the long grind, which is, by the way, how the Tomb Kings win, you have a worse save than me because I am always going to have that rend. And your magical 2 damage and double attacks evaporate like the dreams of Britonia in the wind after that charge turn. And mathematically, you don't blow me up. So we're going to sit there and keep fighting. And you know who's going to win in the grind? It's not the non-regenerating, non-healing, worse armor save, lower damage, non-rending knights. You done blew your wad when you did your sweet 16-inch move and charged all the way across the board right into my territory. You want to charge me on turn 1 on my battle line that far ahead of your army? I'm going to win that combat, and I'm going to have other stuff around because you just said you're on my line. You don't have other knights ready to come and help you right away. So, yeah, you're dead. Mathematically, you're dead. I also can deal mortal wounds sometimes, which you can't. Like, that's just bonus sauce. I don't even need it. It's an inevitability. Like the Tomb Kings themselves, like the inexorable march of death, my victory is inevitable.
Oh. So this is where I get to rebuttal to that, right?
I was just waiting for Vince to just drop a mic.
So, now, I just... Another quick question for you, Vince. What is the...
No, it's good. Change the subject, because I really crushed you on that last one. So if you can find a new topic, it would be best for you at this point. Go ahead.
What is the movement of your Necropolis Knights?
It would be 8. It's pretty garbage.
Yes, it is. So that means that I can get in a charge on them, and then on the following turn, retreat away, and you probably won't be able to reach me, correct?
If you don't retreat away, then yes, you're going to die. That is the answer. Yes, you're right. The only chance you have for survival is to run. You're exactly right. So if you're telling me that your great victory is that you can hit me, do nothing, and then leave, I'll grant you that point. You're absolutely right. We hit you, did 0 damage, you lost no units in the fray because you regen the only thing we killed, and then we boldly charged to the other side of the board. Yeah, knock yourself out, man.
Well, what I would also like to point out, though, is that a unit of Necropolis Knights, at its absolute maximum, it's not taking into account those mortal wounds that it might do. Its maximum damage on its profile is only going to be able to put out 8 damage onto my Pegasus Knights. So that's definitely going to be leaving one of them behind. In the same situation with our math with the Pegasus Knights attacking the Necropolis Knights. So there, I think it's definitely sort of a push. Like, overall, the Pegasus Knights are going to be able to, pound for pound, be taking out roughly the same number of Necropolis Knights as you are able to take out my Pegasus Knights when you're starting to look at it on the model-by-model removal level. So that, overall, puts us at sort of a stalemate. Yes, you can regenerate, but you have to use your caster spells to do that. And
I get one for free.
Commodity.
I get one for free without the spell. And the one you kill on average, I replace. No effort. It just happens.
There
it's okay.
are...
You can go ahead and say, you're right, Vince. I lose. It's fine. I'll accept it. I will beneficently accept your submission, but please continue. If you'd like to go on, I'm more than happy to continue beating you into the dirt. It's fine.
I will definitely say that it is pretty easy with a couple of lucky dice rolls for either of these units to put a hurting on each other in, their charge turn.
Mm-hmm.
The Necropolis Knights are never going to get a charge off on the Pegasus Knights. It's just not going to happen.
0%. 0% that happens. Yep. I will grant you that.
That means on the crackback, right? Like, I go in, I take out your Necropolis Knights, I take out at least one, possibly 2.
Mm-hmm.
And then that means that your attacks back are significantly weaker. You don't have as many knights to be making those attacks back with. So even though on a per model basis, at a unit at full strength, they may be putting out some comparable power, the fact that you're never going to get a charge off on me, that my charge distance and my move distance together are going to put me in a position to always have you on defense, not on offense, and give me that initiative advantage of being able to lay my attacks and damage on your guys before you ever attack me back. That's going to prevent your Necropolis Knights from ever really doing any damage against me. They might take out one of my Pegasus Knights, but on the charge, we do have that 3-up save. Yeah, sure, it goes to a 4-up, but you guys are on a 4-up all the time. So the rend, then, that you have is basically irrelevant because it puts us to a comparable save level.
So what you're saying is, just to clarify your argument here, first of all, anytime somebody starts bringing up lucky dice rolls, that's the sign of flailing. You're looking at the drowning man when they're talking about hoping for the lucky dice rolls. Now, let's talk about averages. Sure, so in this scenario that you've created, you've definitely charged me, and I'll grant you that. Now, if you're going to say every round you get the charge on me every time, well, we both know that's nonsensical. You can retreat your 16 inches. I may or may not charge you the next turn, depending on how the turns go and stuff like that. After round 1, this is all up in the air because, of course, there's going to be a ton of other units on the board and stuff like that. So I'm saying, like, round 1 or early round, you can definitely have your charge. I'll grant you it 0% of the time. I get it on you. You may pick the first engagement. However, if you don't run and then get lucky and stay away from me by either having screening units to get in the way. In other words, you got to bring in a second unit to save your life. Because if you don't, I am going to hunt you down. Because what's your plan here? Retreat away? You're not charging me that turn. So you're going to fight me half the turns of the game? Well, you know what's going to happen if you fight me half the turns of the game? You are definitely going to accomplish nothing. Because I regenerate every round, regardless of whether or not you're fighting me. A model's coming back. That spell is gravy. If I can get that too, neat. I can get 2 5-wound beasts back around. So your little flippy around for like hiding is doing nothing but benefiting me. In the long run, I win. So if you want to fight me 3 rounds out of a 6-round game, maybe by the end of it, you have a knight left. Maybe you don't. Because if they're dead, they're dead. But by the end of the game, my unit's untouched. That's how that breaks out. Like, even with you getting 3 charges out of 6 rounds and nothing else getting in the way, and I never managed to hunt you down, you never kill the unit. But I might kill you. So even in that incredible scenario that you have constructed that's unbelievably beneficial to you, the end result is you get nothing and I kill your unit some percentage of the time that is a non-zero number, which is more because your number is basically 0 that you kill mine. And as to your 4% of the charge, I want to go back to one of your initial points, which I particularly love. You have about a 4% chance of failing a 6 charge. 4% is massive. And for those who don't agree with me and think that that's a very small number, I'd like to have you cast your mind to the number of games you've played back in 8th edition or battle reports you've watched where somebody's like, I had a leadership 10 rerollable and I blew it and the unit ran off the board. The chance of that happening is less than 1%. But yet it seems to happen all the time. Maybe you'll just fail that charge that was less than 6 that you needed. But yet 1 in 25 times, which is what we're talking about with 4%, you're going to drop that number. Do you know how many times I fail that charge? It's 0, Paul. It's 0 times. 0%. That's how many times. Okay? But again, I don't ever need to charge you. You can come on in, buddy. The water's warm. The desert's warm. And its brackish waters are ready to just consume your dumb knights. There you go.
Alrighty, Paul. Do you have any last quick summary to end this? Or have you said everything you need to say?
I would like to add is that Vince started off his last piece of this argument with the comment about lucky dice and arms flailing and and then he finished on, oh wow, look how often this extremely unlikely die roll actually seems to happen. And also intermix in there also several references to some luck of the dice and various other things. We work with the law of averages here. Law of large numbers says if you do something 100 times with a 4% odds of it happening, it should happen 4 times. And I will take those odds because 4 times out of 100 is near zero. That is practically nothing. Law of large numbers overall favors the Pegasus Knights.
You're out of your mind.
Okay.
You just decided to make up math at the end.
It's okay, Vince. It's okay. I'm aware of this. So I totally gave Paul a big handicap in this, but it has to be Vince. Paul, I was really hoping that you were going to, and again, I know I sprung this on you. I pulled a sneaky Skaven on you. But I was really hoping you would touch on how, like, in objective-based games or the ability of them to kill opponents' casters or whatever, that they're so good at that. Or also, I was kind of hoping you broke down the damage, that you had talked about, like, Vince said, we'll give you that you get the charge off, right? So if you waited until you went second so that you had the potential of, again, going first the next round, of how much damage that could do to the Necropolis Knights, you could reduce them to either 0 or 1 before they have a chance to regen, because they only regen during their hero phase. I was hoping you were going to touch on those points, but unfortunately you didn't. So, Vince, you are the Wargames minigame champion.
Well, thank you. There's a reason I was the host. All I can say is, Paul, you made a classic blunder, the first of which being never fight a land war against Russia in the winter, the second of which is fighting Necropolis Knights on combat on my own terms. So, but there you go. It was truly a great fight. You are an excellent combatant, sir.
And you as well. And I have to say, 160 points for those guys?
Yeah, it's ridiculous, isn't it? Yeah, I didn't even have to go to the fact that yours are 200. I left that out.
Yeah.
Yeah, honestly, now that, decision's been decided, like, holy crap, those things are overpowered.
They're really good for their points. They're so good for their points. They're absolutely stupid.
I think the one thing that we can really take away from this fight, though, right, is that ultimately it doesn't matter which of these two wins this fight, because they're all dead. They're all gone. Who cares? They all lost.
Yeah, yes. Yes, indeed.
Alrighty, well, that brings us to perhaps my favorite segment of the show, which is the Spotlight segment. Paul, once again, has been slacking off on us, busy spending all of his time becoming a Pokemon master, achieving his one true dream of gotta catch 'em all. And but that's okay, because we still like him anyways. And for this week's Spotlight, I chose to highlight Skeleton Flower's response to, was it your topic last week, Vince, about the worst tournament ever? Or was that 2 weeks ago?
It's 2 weeks ago now, yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
but I loved Skeleton Flower's response. If you haven't seen his videos, again, Skeleton Flower's the name of his YouTube channel, his stuff is great. First off, I love his accent. I'm typically not a big fan of most accents, but I do enjoy his, and he tells a good story. And so he recounts a story where he was playing a Vampire Count's army, and he went to a tournament, probably the sickest he's ever been in his life, and he tells this, woeful tale of suffering through this and just being basically a walking zombie. And I, of course, asked the question, why didn't you just try to play it off as you were basically cosplaying your army? I feel like that could have made the entire event a lot easier for him, but alas, at the time, he did not think of that. Vince, do you have anything, or shall we move on to the main topic?
For our video picks within the community, sure. There's really been a lot of great stuff recently. Very, very, very impressive content from a lot of people, and I'm just constantly impressed by it. But what I want to point to particularly is one fun thing. So Ant has been playing, he has his new channel, which is HR, right? And he's been playing a few more games of AOS recently, and he wasn't super big into it previously, but he never. It wasn't that he was against it, just wasn't really into it, which is fine. But he's been playing some more games recently, as the General's Handbook has inspired his local community, and it's fun because you can watch him learn and evolve the tactics as he's in these early games. Like, you see him making the mistakes that sort of many of us who play a lot know, and he comes to these realizations like, oh, I really like this thing, or I noticed I could do this thing, or position myself. So it's neat because you get to discover the tactics of Age of Sigmar, which I know obviously for you two gentlemen is a big thing you've always been proponents of, and so it's neat to watch somebody else learn it and experience it in real time. And Ant's always very fun personality who puts together great videos. So there you go. I think he just put up a new one today. He has one from maybe earlier in the week. Check it out.
Absolutely, that'll be linked below as well. All right, Paul.
All right, so that brings us to our main topic of the week. And this week we want to talk about tempo in gameplay in Age of Sigmar. This is one of my favorite topics in gaming in general, is tempo. It's something that I know I've talked about before. I played Magic the Gathering for a long time. I've played a lot of other games. And I think tempo is one of the most important game concepts to get your head around and learn how to use it to your advantage. And just for everybody out there that might not be familiar with it, just sort of at a really high level, what tempo is all about is the pace of gameplay and controlling the pace of gameplay in a way that it comes to your advantage. So, at a very basic sort of level, right? If your opponent is going to benefit from rushing across the battlefield quickly and, having a very quick engagement, working with the tempo of the game, you're going to gain advantage by slowing your opponent's advance down, because that's the thing that they're trying to do with the tempo of the game, right? Like, they're trying to come across as quickly as possible, and if you can slow down their advance, then you're gaining an advantage because you're disrupting their game plan, and you're, in particular, taking that tempo away from them that they were trying to achieve. That gives you a massive advantage because their game plan is suddenly getting shot to hell. With that sort of high-level look, I think I want to throw it over to Vince first on your thoughts on tempo, because I know this is one of those game concepts that you've talked a lot about before, and I know you're a game designer as well, so I'm sure incorporating tempo-oriented elements into games is something that you've thought about as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you think about tempo, for those who are familiar with Magic, you may remember the birth of Red Sly. Okay. Yes. So you gotta understand, tempo, it wasn't like a thing back when I first played Magic. So back in 1994 when I started Magic, there was no conception of tempo as a thing. And then somewhere in the late 90s, someone came up with this deck of Red Sly. And the idea of it was very simple. On turn 1, you would play a 1-cost creature. On turn 2, you'd play a 2-cost creature. On turn 3, you'd play a 2-cost creature and lightning bolt them. On turn 4, you'd play a 2 or 3-cost creature and lightning bolt them, or whatever. Right? The point being, at each turn in the game, you were taking the maximum. No resources are wasted, right? And you're controlling the tempo of the game. You're always using 100% of your resources the way you want to, efficiently. But tempo control, I think, Paul, your example was very good. because I think about, here's an easy example of tempo control from we'll use Bretonnia, because I can think of two very different examples in Warhammer of people who utilize tempo in different ways. So did either of you watch Ant's battle reports back in 8th edition time period when he was playing his Bretonnians heavily?
I watched some of them.
Okay.
I haven't.
Ant, that's fine. Ant controlled the tempo of the game in a very real way. And here's how he would do it. Turn 1, he would march up and give them an 8-inch charge. And then put his Pegasus Knights right in front. Okay? So he had chaff, and he had his charge. Or he had an 8-inch charge on his next turn, and he had Peg Knights to screen. It would be like, bring the lances up, put the Peg Knights in front. Their only choice on their turn was charge the Knights, which are just going to flee, and they're going to basically fail their charge. Okay? Or retreat back. Okay, back up. And people don't generally like to back up. What he would then do turn 2 is charge the Peg Knight out of the way somewhere, and then charge the Knights in, right? And he'd pop like a 6-die, big, like the Beast spell that made you all killer with your characters, and he would just smash their units, right? So at turn 2, he was controlling the tempo, fast aggression, right? He's up, he's setting the level of engagement, he's just determining what's happening, right? Now, reverse that too, but it doesn't, and Red Sly is all, that's playing in a very Red Sly-like fashion. Fast, aggressive, setting the tempo of the game. But you can set it in the opposite direction too, and this is what you were commenting on, Paul, which is you can also go the opposite direction. So Once Bitten play, so Ant was charging on turn 2. If you watch Once Bitten play his Bretonnians from way back, he came to a realization toward the end of his Bretonnian playing that he didn't need to really be in combat until turn 4 or 5. Right? Because his units were tough enough to take the punishment. They, you got a bunch of dudes, high armor saves, they're very tough, they're stable, they can generate a lot of res. So, and what would happen is he would just sit there and wait. And he would wait until he had the perfect charges, and then he would go in. He would just move, he'd create bad situations, same thing here. And it's much the same now, right? So, like, when you look at AOS, you need to think about, when you're thinking about tempo, you need to really think about, and it's so important, especially with random turn order, right? Of like, at what speed should I be choosing to engage the army, moving my units, moving my chaff around, right? You need to be able to determine when the engagements are going to happen, knowing that you don't necessarily know who has the next turn, right? Am I aiming to be fighting in turn 2, or am I aiming to be fighting in turn 4 or 5, right? What's the tempo of this game going to be? And that especially becomes more complex when you throw in scenarios. Like, where am I going to need to be in turn 4 or 5 to win this scenario, right? So all of that figures into your tempo, using those units at the right time. Yeah, that's sort of my initial thoughts about it. It's such a hugely important thing. If you just sort of take the bait and charge whatever's there and do whatever's there in front of you, you are giving the tempo game over to your opponent, right? You're just saying, you're just letting it happen, and that means your opponent can seize and determine the speed and engagement of the battle. Whereas if you control it, if you seek to don't just take that charge because it's there, think about it. Maybe instead this turn you run back a little bit, so you can control the tempo better. Bring another unit in, make them move around. Then you get a double or triple charge, right? Something like that.
Yeah. I think the key thing with tempo too is that no matter what you're doing, and this was actually from an article that I saw about Magic a while ago, that it was on Card Advantage, which is sort of tempo related, but the concept relates to tempo very closely. That basically, if you are the aggressor in a tempo situation, if you're going for that hyper-aggressive, charge across the table really quickly strategy, you are controlling the tempo as well in that situation, because what you're doing is you're denying your opponent their game plan if it is anything other than charge across the table as quickly as possible and get into a lot of combats. So even though you are just being quick and aggressive, you're controlling the tempo of the game. You're dominating the tempo by denying your opponent that ability to really respond and have their game plan. Controlling tempo isn't just about slowing the game down. It's about being able to speed the game up in the right way at the right times. And depending on your list build, if you're going for a hyper-aggressive, what are the advantages of being really aggressive and getting across the battlefield really quickly? Well, it could make your opponent's shooting less effective, right? Like, you're going to get less shots off with shooters because as soon as they get into combat, they're going to just explode most of the time. Like, most units that have a missile attack have, like, a 6-up armor save or a 5-up armor save, so they're just going to die if they ever get into combat. And a lot of them don't have a stand-and-shoot ability, so they're just going to get shredded if your opponent gets up in your face. So I think controlling the tempo really goes in both directions. James, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, first I just want to say I think both of y'all have defined it quite well. And I just want to add in too that just to clarify, in case someone's not as familiar with the concept of tempo, it doesn't necessarily, when we say you're moving quickly, you're doing whatever, it doesn't necessarily mean that your turns are short, right? It doesn't mean that you're basically like hurrying through your turns, moving your models as quickly as you can physically, like in the shortest amount of time across the table. It's in terms of like your game plan, how far are you moving, how early in terms of what turn it is that you're, being aggressive or hanging back. And Paul, I think you made a good point about, and Vince as well, obviously, about the tempo control can really occur in any end of the spectrum. It can be quick or slow. You can be attempting to determine it, and it can fluctuate within the game. And one thing that I think's important, because I didn't play Magic, and I now play Hearthstone, which is clearly based upon Magic, and that's really when I began to hear the concept of tempo and began to really understand it. I understood it to a degree, but not as deeply as I feel like I did afterwards. But your armies and your units are going to inherently have within their profile kind of like the leaning towards which way they are best suited for. That doesn't mean that you're restricted to that's the only way you can play them. And in fact, the way that the battle is going, the way that the objectives are for the game, that will in many cases determine what path is best for you to take in terms of attempting to control the tempo, which in many ways allows you to control the entire game. For an example of this, in Age of Sigmar, I just played the first mission this past Tuesday for the Season of War campaign, and in that one, basically, it was a 5-turn game. The board was divided up into 4 segments. You each had a 12-inch segment, because it's a 4x6 that we were playing on. So your 12 inches on your side that were closest to the center of the table, and then your second segment, again, the other 12 inches. Basically, you had to get your troops from your side to your opponent's back 12 inches without allowing them to get their units to your back 12 inches at the end of turn 5. Whoever had the most, their won. And so in that game, I had things like zombies, right? And zombies are perhaps the best unit in the game for denying your opponent the ability to play an up-tempo, quick kind of game, because they are, if you look in the dictionary, you're going to see zombies under the section called Tar Pit. It's going to say see zombies. And they do it perhaps better than anybody else, especially with the, in essence, ward save that we've been given from the General's Handbook. And then they can regen with their, D6 standing back up each turn. And then, you can potentially summon more in. If you kill something, there's a 1 in 6 chance that they regen 1 more that way. All that being said, I was able to use the zombies in that game to tie up my opponent's forces, which were dwarves anyway, so they were already slow, and to prevent them from being able to get to my back lines until very, very late in the game. And I had, for example, my Vampire Lord on Zombie Dragon and my Blood Knights playing very much more of a quick tempo, where they were intentionally hitting a target and then moving further along the board, because my opponent had brought things like an organ gun and he had his Dwarf King, these high priority targets that could very much impact the way the game went. And so I wanted to quickly remove them. So I was attempting to slow down my opponent's army, but at the same time speed up the tempo in terms of removal of important assets of his army. So you can do both at the same time. It's really a matter of what do you use with each unit in each situation?
Yeah, and that also, using different units in different situations, I think brings up a good point about, having units that can be versatile as well. You want to be able to have a unit that can control the tempo of the game. That's one of the big reasons why I really like using cavalry a lot in Age of Sigmar, because they're extremely mobile. They have really long move distances, usually have charge bonuses, so they can hang back and they can pick and choose, like we had in the Pegasus Knight discussion. The Necropolis Knights, your big advantage is your mobility, right? Like, you can pick and choose when those combats happen, and you get bonuses on the charge, and you're basically deciding when the charges happen. And by being able to make those decisions, you end up with a really strong advantage, because you're controlling an aspect of the game.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned the idea of, we talked about Pegasus Knights obviously quite a bit in this episode, but it's a great example of, like, Pegasus Knights are such a good unit for doing things like tempo control, like to jump on. I know I slammed on them a whole bunch, but I really do actually love them as a unit. And they're, for tempo control, they're just one of the best around, because they can be in your opponent's face turn one, or they can be flying around being basically incredibly evasive, so you never touch them, and deciding the tempo in the late game, right? Deciding, cleaning up remaining combats, holding key scenario objectives at the right moment, blowing away small units that are still sitting on something. So they're like classic tempo control, because they can act efficiently on almost any turn of the game, right? And that's what it's about. It's about, tempo control is about taking your unit and figuring out what is the maximum efficiency I can derive from this unit in every turn of the game, right? So none of that resources is wasted. At the start of my turn, each of my units has some percentage of its possible efficiency it could do, right? It could gain. And that could be from something like your shooting unit, turn one it could be useful if you can get it in a range, right? But if it sits there out of range, it's not hitting its maximum efficiency, right? So just kind of making sure you're hitting that is a big part of tempo.
Absolutely. I think that goes pretty well, Paul, with what we talked about in, I think it was actually our first video, where we talked about with the Alpha Strike and the, like the denying your opponent the resources and all, and tempo control, as Vince was saying, is so much of maximizing your own unit's potential, your own resources you have on the table, while also minimizing your opponent's ability to effectively use their resources.
Yeah. What I think is really interesting on this topic, what this definitely makes me think of, is those early battle reports that we saw from Age of Sigmar when the game was first launched, and everybody kind of had that initial, like, rugby scrum in the middle of the board, and there is that, like, at the initial game, everybody was playing without, like, tempo in mind. Like, you had starter set executors that have, that can throw hammers from a distance. They're sort of Pegasus Knight. What's that?
I said, I think we're starting to lose you. You were breaking up really bad there for a minute there.
Oh, okay. What was the last thing you coherently heard me say that?
The last thing that I heard clearly was that there was basically a scrum in the middle.
Right. That scrum in the middle that we had with the early games and early battle reports, into account tempo at that point in time. It was, everybody was learning the rules, and they were just kind of moving their stuff forward and fighting. But even with the stuff that we had in the starter set, right? We have that role to the Pegasus Knights. They harass around the outside. They can pick and choose charges. They can clear. It's because they have a large movement range. Opportunity for a lot of people to be using those to control, to move them up and bait a charge and counter charge after that initial combat, and retreat them back and use their hammer attacks thrown at a distance. So, I hate to always kind of keep going back to the, like, oh man, all of these people that criticized Age of Sigmar early on were so wrong, but I think that was part of it, was that the flow of the game, the movement, people were and weren't employing these ideas about tempo in their early games, and they suddenly saw, like, oh, this doesn't seem like there's really any tactics. Everything is just, move up and fight. But really, because we have such fluid movement in Age of Sigmar, it really gives you a lot of opportunity to play with tempo and play with interesting tactical elements around that. Time and movement in general, we really have the opportunity to do some really crazy things with that now.
Absolutely. I think that one of the things that, again, Magic and Hearthstone and games like these, right, these card games, that in many ways I think tempo is a little bit easier in them, not necessarily to pull off or all, but to show examples of and to understand is really you have to know what you have and know really how it plays, right? Like, you have to understand, like, this card, it can play quickly, this card can play slowly, these units move quickly, they can react quickly in this way, they can't react quickly in this way, whatever it is. And so to truly, kind of optimize your ability to control the tempo of the game, again, whether it's fast or slow pace, whatever it is that might be advantageous for you at the time, really the way that you truly come into being able to effectively do that is knowing your units and learning more about them. And clearly at the very beginning of such a strong shift between classic fantasy in, the 8th edition in times to Age of Sigmar, which is completely different, clearly it would take time for players to make that adjustment to truly be able to take advantage of tempo control in the new system.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not weird. Like, again, as I mentioned, it took a long time. It took years for Magic to have any conception of this kind of tactic, right? Like, for a long time, I would see decks that were solely, like, creatures starting at 4 power. Like, the lowest casting cost card in the deck was a 4 casting cost card, right? And that is insane. That is suicide. Right, like you wouldn't. That would be crazy to do it in later years of Magic, unless you had some kind of really wacky mid-range strategy. But you're just giving over too much tempo control to your opponent when you can do nothing for the first 3 turns of the game. So it's the same way here. There's an army building component to this as well, right? And this is one of those things where good list building, like, I don't care points or not. That's not the relevant question to me, right? I don't care what building system you're using. Use whatever you like, but there's a list building component here too, because some units are better in the tempo game than others, right? We mentioned Peg Knights. Like, zombies are good for certain activities, but they're not a good tempo unit in all turns of the game, because realistically they're slow enough that turn 1 and 2, there's not much they can do other than shuffle about, right? I mean, they can sort of get up to your opponent or something. So zombies are a very important component of, say, controlling your mid-game engagement, right? They're like they actually end up, even though they're cheap, they end up filling the role of, like, mid-power creatures in Magic or something like that, because that's when they start to become effective slightly into the turns of the game, when you can get them in engagements, when you can tar pit a unit, when you can take something out, right, and control the sort of battle. Whereas Ironically, the more elite fast units that can get around are more your 1-drops, your 2-drops in Magic, the fast tempo out of the gate, decide the early stuff. Having a breakdown, having that, and almost every army has stuff that can do this, by the way. Like, I don't know of any army that doesn't have some reach into all these things. So having a list building conception of like, when do I need to have, making sure I can be functional in all the turns of the game is very much an element of controlling tempo, right? It's not just how you play the units, but take it back a step pre-game. It's about choosing what goes into your army, right? So that's what I would say. There's 2 phases to it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Choices. Effectiveness. Did I freeze or did you guys freeze?
It's all you. Your connection is like not super great right now. I'm not gonna lie to you.
Yep. It's just Connecticut, being tiny and subpar again. They can't afford the. They don't have enough space for the proper, setup for their internet.
That must be what it is. Yeah, Paul's got to go out and kick the hamster. It's clearly tired tonight. It's running slow. Yeah, absolutely. That's but yes, like there's definitely like it's something you need to think about sort of at all points throughout your gameplay, right? Tempo is such a big deal. It's not a thing you can ignore during list building. It's not a thing you can ignore during the game. And I think it's something that is a fairly, like, you're right, it's harder to think about in terms of war games or AOS or whatever. But it's absolutely something that really good players and people who tend to win in these sorts of like very competitive environments do think about heavily, because they don't just take the unit and say, well, I hope this all works out, right? They're thinking about, what am I doing on turn 1, what am I doing on turn 2, and so on and so forth, that's going to maximize my chances of winning this game, not just in terms of how I use my units, but how I'm interacting with the scenario. What are their units going to be doing, right? What's the tempo my opponent is going to try to set, right? What does he need to do to get his maximum efficiency, and then denying him that stuff. If he has those fast-moving units that he's going to try to retreat or retreat into an advantageous position, like he's going to try to take his Peg Knights into something easy and then retreat behind your line to go get at your good stuff, right? Because there's nothing saying you can't retreat forward, which is a very good tactic for Peg Knights, the old forward retreat. Just block your lines, right? Like, they have to end 3 inches away from an enemy, make it so there's nowhere for them to land in that area where there's not a person within 3 inches, or put them in a position where if they do land 3 inches away, it's suicide, right? Because they landed right next to something that's going to hack them down, right? So it's thinking about not just your own efficiency, but also how your opponent's going to try to control that tempo.
It's definitely thinking more than just the next step. You have to really control tempo. Be thinking 2, 3, 4 steps ahead. You can't just be okay, I'm going to move my guy here, and then next turn I'll charge. Like, if you do that, then you're probably not going to be able to control the tempo because you're not thinking far ahead enough. You have to really plan in advance to control it, because it is such a fluid concept. Yep,
absolutely. And it's one of the tougher concepts to get down, but it's also one of the frightening ones. In Magic, I think of the first time I ran up against Red Sly, and I was like, dear God, Magic is never going to be the same. Like, I mean, it was a sea change, man. It was a paradigm shift. Believe you me, like, the first time I fought a deck like that, because I had classically played very slow decks that just, were dumb, and I didn't think too deeply about it, and then I saw somebody who did play with it, and I was like, oh my God, this game has completely changed. Right? It just it completely flipped the script on my expectations of the game. And it's absolutely the same thing here.
Yep. So
that was definitely one of the big.
Oh, you're back, Paul. Good. I was gonna ask. Oh, actually, I said he's back, and now he's gone.
I'm sure he'll be back in a second. He's like I say, he's kicking the hamster. It's fine.
Yeah. So, Vince, I know that you play a couple different armies in Age of Sigmar.
I do.
And I know that you have enough experience in Magic and in this game, obviously. and you're obviously knowledgeable about tempo, and you think about it in games. And at least for myself, I've noticed that regardless of what's necessarily the best strategy, I do have my natural proclivities that, all things considered, I'm most likely to fall into. Do you notice that with yourself, and what would you say is your natural tendency to play with your main army, or whichever one you're currently focused on the most? It's not necessarily always it, because obviously scenarios and the what's going on in the battlefield can influence it, but what your your standard go-to that your proclivities lean towards.
Sure. Yeah, I think that, well, it's, you really put me in a box here, because if I answer no, I never have this problem, then boy, then aren't I being a completely unhumble person? But no, obviously I do. Certainly we all sometimes fall into our natural proclivities, right? I mean, yeah, 100%. And I think mine that I always try to tap down on is the rush to go forward, right? Like, I want to red slide. I want to just be like across the table and in their face and running at people. And I find the thing that you have to, and this is what was happening in the beginning, like what Paul mentioned, those early reports, people were just giving into their sort of like base instinct of like, let's go kill them, right? And that's what it was. And I get that. Like, it's fun. I understand. And certainly there are some armies that can do that more successfully. I don't play sit back and shoot armies, so I'm not a cheater like Paul would be the point. But I do play against sit back and shoot armies. So like me getting across the table, like in a situation like that, you then start to feel like, oh, I've really got to get across the table quick, right? Like, I'm under cannon fire and stuff like that. If I don't get there now, I'm dead. But the reality is that's not true. Like, I'm not saying you should dawdle and just sit around and take cannonballs in the face. But you should think about, like, if your opponent's really going to sit back, then good. Don't just run willy-nilly. Pick your combats, right? Like, that just gives you the freedom to completely orient your board and pick your fights exactly how you want. Take the one extra turn to make sure that everything happens the way you want it to. That if you can pick apart their forces, make them move in some way against you in the way you're scooting, and by doing so, you sort of stripped apart that synergy in any way that they have, you're going to come out a lot better, right? So it's just a question of, like, for me, the way that I try to control tempo is wait, just wait. Because people often have a plan in turns 1 and 2, maybe, something like that. Like, people show up to the table with some kind of conception of what they want to do the first couple turns, but people don't usually have a conception of what they're doing in the latter turns, right? So start thinking more about that. Oftentimes, the first couple turns for me are just like holding pattern. I'm like Maverick playing poker. I promise to lose to you for an hour, and then once I see the tells, I'm in, right? Because that's when their plans fall apart. They haven't thought this far ahead yet. So now we're on even footing, or I can be on a better footing, etc.
I feel like for our hopeful eventual game events that it might end up being very boring, because my natural proclivity is to sit back as well. So we can sit there for the first 2 to 3 turns of the game. No one moves. Just
yeah, sure. Just doing this. Where are you going? What are you doing? All right.
Exactly.
Yeah. Just kind of fainting at each other for 2 hours, yeah. And then suddenly on turn 5, we've got to have like all the combats. Like, everybody go, go, go! We got to kill some stuff. Oh my god.
Yeah.
Yes, I look forward to that. That should be a tremendous amount of fun. I've played a couple of those chess match games before, and it is really, it's a completely different game, because it generally only happens when both people like it, right? Because you don't ever get that game accidentally. Like, if somebody is a go-forward player. So it turns into a very cerebral experience, and I don't mean that in any kind of insulting way to the other ones. I just mean, like, a lot of the game is happening sort of in your head, not on the table, because you're doing these back and forth feints at each other as opposed to, like, actually engaging. It's a very different experience. Yeah.
I think it's funny because, like, basically with the way Paul described it, and you kind of mentioned it, whenever Age of Sigmar came out, and I kind of pointed to this with our our last video where we talked about the Stormcast and how they're the poster boys, and I made the comment near the end how I was like, it looks like the Stormcast actually fit the game really well because, they seem on the surface very simple and easy to play, but to actually use them effectively requires much more thought. And Age of Sigmar, again, is a very simple game to learn, but I always say difficult to master, in part because of its simplicity. But at the beginning of the story, we had, and when the game first came out, we had Khorne, right? And everyone was just overtaken by that bloodlust and was just running forward to Khorne's glory to just spill blood in the middle of the battlefield. So, as things have kind of calmed down and we've started to have these other releases of other races, everyone's kind of taken their chill pill and relaxed. But at first, everyone was saying blood for the blood god.
Which, admittedly, is a pretty good thing to say. It's fun.
Yeah.
I have a Khorne army, too. It is fun to just get up in it. Like, when I do play my Khorne force, it's almost always as, like, I don't play them very seriously. And I am just like, let's go! Khorne cares not from whence the blood flows. Like, my own units are yours. Whatever happens, stuff's gonna die. Because here I come. Like, that's the army I play when I want to give in to my wild abandon.
Right.
I don't try to play them smart.
Paul, are you there?
Yeah.
Alrighty.
Yeah, can you guys actually hear me now?
Yes, you're
yay.
coming through fine for me. So do you want me to repeat the question real quick to you, Paul, or did you understand what we were talking about?
I did not catch the question.
Okay, so basically I asked Vince, like, obviously, as we're talking about tempo, depending on the circumstances of the game, you're going to want to be flexible, right? But we all, as human beings, have natural proclivities towards certain things. And so I was asking Vince what his natural proclivities were in Age of Sigmar. Does he typically approach more of a slow tempo, fast tempo? How does he typically approach the game from a tempo standpoint? So I was going to pose the same to you.
I struggled with it a little bit in Age of Sigmar because I have way too much to, like, I just want to scream blood for the blood god and run across the table. It's just, like, not the right thing to do. And typically when I play Magic, I was playing, like, forever. Like that was probably, like, 90% of the games we're playing blue, like the really slow plotting defensive style of deck in any game is usually the long strategy.
Well, we're losing you again, Paul.
So in range, what I've been trying to trend toward in general is that more mid-range strategy where you're more flexible and you're my natural more to be responsive to what my opponent's doing. Because I think being responsive in general is has always been that I play. Now I'm taking it more where responsive in a defensive way. Now I'm also brings the fight to my opponent when it's to do that, right? Like when you need to go charge in head on it, have your gun line to you. Magic. The thing that you need to do is and by being aggressive to do. So that's kind of where I'm at responsive, reactionary sort of player.
Yeah. I know for myself in Age of Sigmar, contrary to Vince and his bloodlust, and I guess even a little bit less than you too, is it's always been my tendency in every strategy game. I've always described it as I'm overly cautious. I perhaps don't take advantage of weaknesses in my opponent's line, at least in the past, when I ought to have. And as I talked about in the Topic of the Week response, when I talked about how Death Faction's my favorite army I've played in any war game, because I don't really care that something dies, because like a zombie dies, it'll come back, right? Whether you're playing the match play system or the open play system, there's ways to bring your troops back. There's ways that if you get in a bad ambush with your rank and file, then more often than not you'll end up okay. And so that's allowed me to up my tempo a bit, but it's definitely my natural tendency to be very reactionary, to want to slow the pace of the game down as opposed to speeding it up.
Yeah, it's funny, Paul, because I used to play the same blue-white decks you're talking about. Like, so when I started playing Magic very shortly after that, I developed my version of the deck. Anybody who played back in there knows the deck. So, I didn't. There was no internet. I just literally stumbled onto the same deck as a bunch of other people had been doing at the same time.
Yeah.
My kill card was Brain Geyser, to give everybody who might have played during that time an example. I had one kill card in the deck. That kill card was Brain Geyser. I would make you draw your cards to death. I had 0 damage in the deck. Okay, it was all control, and it was long game control. But in war games, it's exactly the opposite problem. I don't know what it is. Something about it, man, just takes over, and I'm like, yeah, let's go kill some things. You know, it's a completely different sort of a different thing triggers in my brain. So it's very funny how people sort of meet the different mediums and you interact with it.
Yeah. What I think is really interesting in Age of Sigmar, it really changes how I play the game a lot, is being able to shoot into combat now. And I know a lot of people have made a big deal about that, and I don't think you can make a big enough deal about being able to shoot into combat and shoot out of combat. Because that completely screws with the tempo of the game, right? Like, your shooters basically would turn off before if you got into combats out in front of them. Now it's like you want to chaff up your opponent in front of your shooters to hold them there and just get, like, pummeled to death with arrows and bullets and javelins and whatever other crap is being thrown at them, right?
Yeah, 100%. It's absolutely true. It does change. It changes the math, right? I mean, that's what it does.
Yeah.
In what to me is a very fun way. Like, a lot of people complain about the shooting in combat. I love it because even though I run armies that are light on shooters, it's still fun to have to deal with for me. It presents me with an interesting sort of tactical challenge, which I appreciate.
Right. And I think all of the shooting units seem to have gotten priced at a level that makes it fair, right? Like, all of the artillery is really expensive.
Yes, it is.
Like, even more expensive than 8th edition. Like,
right.
So it's definitely, infantry shooting, definitely also pretty expensive too. But, yeah, it makes it really interesting, and it shifts the way you play. And that shooting now too, in the move and shoot. Now you can just march your dudes up and shoot your opponent instead of having to hang out in the backfield and shoot. Yeah, I mean, there's just so many little things in Age of Sigmar that have, like, the seemingly small rules changes that, like, completely have screwed with the tempo of the game, and it's really sped the whole thing up a lot.
Well, absolutely. I mean, Age of Sigmar is probably the fastest-paced game I've ever played, and I don't know, I've played probably somewhere around 12 to 15 different, like, tabletop war games throughout the years, but you know what I was going to say, Paul, about like the whole shooting aspect is like the way that I look at shooting is basically the same way I look at the Pegasus Knights, again, to use the same example. It's like shooting is just, in essence, a melee attack where you can't be attacked back, right? And it's so, in a way, it's like their movement and their shooting range is the exact same as the Pegasus Knights' movement and then charging in. It's just their effectiveness over a segment of the battlefield. So just shooting units have the ability to be extremely high tempo. They have the ability to be extremely fast because they can reach out, they can touch you so quickly. So I think the best way for you as an opponent, because again, I don't have any Tomb King models, so I literally bring 0 shooting in my army, is to just look at them in the same way as you would look at a Pegasus Knight or something else that has an extremely large movement and potential charge range. It's conceptually very similar.
Now, as a total aside to this, Vince, you probably know this better than I do, but in the Kings of War line, are there skeleton archers that are reasonably do they produce skeleton archers for Kings of War, or are those all?
Yes, they do.
They do. So those might be reasonable replacements.
Well, the whole Mantic line.
Terrible.
Yeah, yes, like the Mantic line, they have and are coming out with more for their Tomb King's replacement army. I think the thing that people are most excited about is actually the sort of Shabti style replacements. But yes, they do exist. I would not call them. Excuse me, my goodness. I wouldn't call them great models.
Yeah.
That's what I would say.
I was really excited when I saw that they had them. I was like, awesome! I can get these Tomb King archers, basically, a alternate model instead of having to pay a lot of money to buy a bunch of Reaper skeleton archers and then convert them up slightly to be in my army. And I took one good look at these guys and I was like, I'm going to pass on these skeletons.
I will.
I actually like. Yeah, I actually like some of the Mantic range. Like, I played Dreadball, and I like the models that I have from it. I have no complaints about it. I play the Teratons, which are their giant space turtles, and I have them painted up as the Ninja Turtles. But they look fine, but their skeletons, their faces are not very good. The skeletons, yeah, I won't be picking them up. So there's your answer.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate, but there we are. Yeah, I mean, there's just not a lot of great replacement models out there. All right. Probably tangential to the conversation, but yes. Skeleton Archer's pretty good, I guess. There you go. We'll tie that back in.
Yes.
Yeah. Especially for death that doesn't have enough shooting.
Right.
Well, I think that we've covered that pretty well. Do you all have any final thoughts on Tempo before we turn to Misplay of the Day?
My final thought would be just, it might sound like this is a lot of wankery about this sort of thing, right? Like you think, come on, how much does it really matter? Well, I assure you, the number, yes, it might be harder to understand or predict than it is in something like Magic, but there have been just tens of thousands of words written on this in Magic, right? So it's a thing, it's very real, and it can have a huge impact on your game. So I would just challenge you to, think about it the next time. Think about your timing, when your units are acting, when do you need to be doing certain things, and getting that maximum efficiency out of there, and see if it doesn't change your game around. That's what I would say. Give it a shot.
Yeah, and just to give people some perspective that aren't that familiar with Magic, Tempo is a deck archetype in Magic these days. So, just to give you a concept of how important it really is, that people build solely around controlling tempo. And I think we can do that in Age of Sigmar. And one of the things that I'm hoping to see in AOS is people talking less about which specific army they're playing and more about what kind of strategy they're playing. Because all of these different armies, they have a lot of different things they can do. If you're playing a death army, there's a lot of different death builds that you can come up with, right? So I'd really like to see people start thinking more in terms of what's my strategy, what's my game plan, more so than what army am I playing. because that was always, like, when I was playing Magic, that was always my starting point. After my blue-white control days, it was, okay, what is my game plan? What are the key elements to do this? And then I figured out what colors I was playing after that, right? The what thing am I doing this with was always kind of like the secondary afterthought. It was, what's the framework first?
Right.
And I think with Warhammer, it seems like people start with what army do I have in front of me, and then try and build a strategy from there.
Good point. Yeah. All right, Paul, so I do believe you have a misplay of the day for us, sir.
Yes. So this goes right along with list building, definitely. This was largely a list building misplay. So I played a game of Triumph and Treachery yesterday, and I brought my free people, and I thought it was going to be like this great fun idea. Like, I'm going to be, that crazy random element. I'm going to bring a trebuchet, and I'm going to try and make everybody bribe me to not shoot them. And turn one, that did not work. No takers, so I just shot at a threat. By the bottom of turn one, I had all of my artillery crew shot off the board by other artillery, and I had no opportunity to really use them for the rest of the game. So that was 220 points out of a 1,000-point list. That was like total trash. That didn't do anything. They probably knocked like 80 points off the table on their own. So yeah, that was my big misplay, definitely. It was putting too many eggs in one basket, trying to be fun, and not kind of missing the point, I think.
I think I'm going to contend that's less of a list building misplay and more of a misjudgment of your opponent's psyche and how they would respond.
That is true. Well, I mean, the logical thing to do, right? Like, if you're in a 6-player game, it's pretty logical to think that somebody's going to be able to either deep strike or shoot your artillery crew off the board, and I really was just not even thinking about that. And it was done in a way that I couldn't even do anything about, right? Because the shots came out of a steam tank, not out of another artillery piece. So I couldn't have killed a steam tank in one shot if I tried. Actually, well, theoretically I could have. I could have dropped 2 rocks on it and rolled boxcars for damage, but that has really, really long odds of ever happening. So
Yoda would be so ashamed of you. You fail because you don't believe. There is no try, only do or do not.
Well, in this case, I think what he's saying is he would likely do not.
I know, yeah.
Yes, I really should have chosen the do not and go with something more interesting.
Right. Well, here, let me comment on your story real quick here, Paul. How much multiplayer Magic did you play?
Not a lot.
That sounds like it. Okay. I could have told you that was the. I knew that was going to be your answer before you said it. Let me tell you why I know that. Because I've played a lot. Okay, like I used to basically run a card shop playing Magic back in the 90s with a friend of mine, and we would have massive multiplayer games, like 20, 25 player multiplayer games. Okay.
Oh, wow.
And here's how you lose a multiplayer game like that right away. Are you familiar with the card Siphon Soul?
Not off the top of my head.
All right, doesn't matter. 2 colorless, 1 black effect, sorcery effect. All other players lose 2 life. You gain 2 life for each life lost in this way. The card is specifically structured for multiplayer, right? Because it isn't your opponent, it's all other players, okay? So in a 20-person game, you Siphon Soul, 19 people lose life, right? You gain like 38 life, and then you never go again, okay? Because everybody is like, oh no, screw you in particular, right? And anything that anyone can do to you, every lightning bolt, every creature that can get in the red zone, everything comes after you, okay? Yep. And what you did by showing that trebuchet hand was saying, "Whoops, Siphon Soul, I'm the big spoiler," and everybody was like, "No, screw that thing in particular. Forget you, buddy. Like, we're all coming out because we don't want that wild card happening, right? People in multiplayer games hate a wild card. The worst thing you're like a guy in a prison camp who's just like the guards are coming in to execute somebody, and you're like going, "Woo, pick me!" Like that's all you just said. Like you got to take it down a notch. The way to survive that multiplayer is you sit back and you be quiet. Shh. Silence isn't punished, but big artillery that shows you're gonna reach out and screw with people is. That was your only play. Like if I would have had it, I would have just been like, "Nah, I'm good. Let's get my shooting this turn." Like, don't even let them know. And then later on, that's when you get it out. But no, that's very fun. I love it.
And the ultimate winner of that game was actually a Sylvaneth player that just like slow and plod.
Yep, absolutely. Sounds
the
right
first
to me.
3 turns, and then yep.
Love it.
Yeah. So yeah, that is my glorious misplay of the day, and I will probably make that mistake over and over and over again.
That's
nice.
Okay. At least you had fun doing it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Shoot. I have one, if I may share one too. That's relatively
absolutely.
Feel free. We don't force our guests to shame themselves with a misplay of the day, but if you would like to volunteer one and join us in our self-deprecating behavior, by all means.
Oh, happily. So I also played a game of Triumph and Treachery yesterday. How about that? Because almost all of my games are multiplayer, so there was a big block of 20 handgunners. Because I have a friend who always plays free people and always plays all guns. We were playing like 1,500 points. His army consisted of 2 massive groups of handgunners in the middle of everything to where you couldn't charge anything without getting handgunned from the stand and shoot response. So it was like 2 giant blocks of handgunners, 2 cannons, a steam tank, and a Huracanum like buff wagon sitting in the middle bonusing everything. It was this tiny little block of just gun, right? So I had a decent charge with my Sorcerer Lord on Manticore and 5 Chaos Knights into those handgunners. Now you can only declare the stand and shoot reaction against 1 unit, right? So I'm not worried about like I'm gonna get one of those in without getting shot. And he shot the Chaos Knights, but didn't really do much damage to them. The misplay was I vastly overestimated the amount of damage that 5 Chaos Knights and a Sorcerer Lord on Manticore could do to handgunners in a turn. Those Chaos Knights are just so tragically underwhelming in the kill division. They're quite tough, but they're not. But they don't murder many things. Especially since I didn't have like the lances or the glaives or whatever that would have made me more dangerous in charge. So I charged in there, killed a little more than half the unit, and then he got first turn in the next round. And it was like, boop, all the guns just turned, and it was just like, right? Because I had brought myself into range of this other massive block of handgunners in every cannon. And so then at the end of the round, I had like 1 Chaos Knight left and no Lord on Manticore, and I was like, oh, yeah. That's a great example of where I should have waited another turn, right? Swung the army around to where I could have had 4 units in there charging. Because I could have just waited another turn, moved up, brought everything else in my tight little bubble, because I was running like an all Zinch force with an altar, buff wagon, just like passing out ward, like basically the ward save and the rerolls, and we were all just moving forward. So I had the ultimate counter to him, right? Because I was super buffed on all my saves and rerolls. I could have just been patient, rolled up, brought the whole army to bear, and crushed him, but I didn't. And there we go. So ended up picking up the unit and some other stuff, but it wasn't as good as I could have hoped. And then the other player got in the mix, and so that was also fun. There you go. Patience. My misplay goes exactly at what I mentioned I have a problem with earlier. Patience.
Yes. Oh. So I hope everybody out there has learned from our follies today. So, James, anything else you have? I know you were talking before the show about your glorious game recently where you had absolutely zero misplays, and it was the finest game of Age of Sigmar you have ever played. Perhaps anyone had ever played.
I didn't say that. I said it may be the greatest game of any single game of any strategy game I've ever played, because I couldn't. Not that I didn't make any mistakes, but none of my mistakes that I made came back to haunt me in any way.
All right. So everybody out there, be like James.
Yeah, just stop making mistakes. I mean, geez, come on.
Yeah.
Or make ones that don't matter. What's the matter with you?
Yeah. The world would be a better place if that's what everyone did.
Tonight's advice: play better. It's a solid advice.
Yes.
Solid advice.
All right. Well, with that, I think that's about all we have for today. Anybody have anything else we want to add before we sign off?
I just want to say thank you, Vince, so much for joining us. I know you said before that getting guests on shows and trying to, having 3 or more people schedules meet up at the same time is like herding cats, and trying to set up this week and next week's videos with guests has truly taught me the wisdom of those words. But thank you so much for taking the time out to join us for this.
Yes, thank you very much for being here, Vince.
Absolute pleasure. I love hanging out and talking all this stuff with both you gentlemen. I apologize that I contributed to that headache, as I know I did, because my schedule was an absolute wreck and then I was late. But that being said, I am very glad that you all had me on. I would love to come back anytime. Super fun. I love discussing this stuff, and both of you gentlemen always have very, very good insights into everything. So, absolute pleasure.
Well, thank you very much for being here, and thank you all out there for watching. So that puts another one in the can for Tactica Tuesdays, and I believe we will see you all later.
Have a good one.